Well, good morning. I am Clarke Englund. I'm the Sunday school teacher for the adult Bible class at New Braunfels Bible Church. And last week we looked at both Isaiah chapter 38 and chapter 39. These two historical chapters happened prior to chapters 36 and 37. And we don't know exactly why they're chronologically out of order. It could be that this was to allow the section on Assyria to close out in chapter 37, and the section on Babylon to start in chapter 38. Dr. Oswalt suggests that the writer wanted to show the fallibility of Hezekiah because with his great success in standing up to Sennacherib and trusting God in chapters 36 and 37, many people could have chosen to think that he might be the Messiah, he might be the chosen one. But yet in chapters 38 and 39, we see his fallibility, we see his humanity. And so we know he cannot be the chosen one. He cannot be the Messiah that was promised back in Isaiah chapter 9, 11, and 16. And so that is as good a point as any to consider why these four chapters are chronologically out of order. But now we get to chapter 40. And so let me read from the New Living Translation. And it says, "Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem. Tell her the sad days are gone and her sins are pardoned. Yes, the Lord has punished her twice over for all her sins. Listen, it's the voice of someone shouting, clear the way through the wilderness for the Lord. Make a straight highway through the wasteland for our God. Fill in the valleys and level the mountains and hills. Straighten the curves and smooth out the rough places. Then the glory of the Lord will be revealed and all people will see it together. The Lord has spoken." A voice said, "Shout." I asked, "What should I shout?" "Shout that people are like the grass. Their beauty fades as quickly as the flowers in a field. The grass withers and the flowers fade beneath the breath of the Lord, and so it is with people. The grass withers and the flowers fade, but the word of our God stands forever. O Zion, messenger of good news, shout from the mountaintops. Shout it louder, O Jerusalem. Shout and do not be afraid. Tell the towns of Judah, your God is coming. Yes, the sovereign Lord is coming in power. He will rule with a powerful arm. See, he brings his reward with him as he comes. He will feed his flock like a shepherd. He will carry the lambs in his arms, holding them close to his heart. He will gently lead the mother sheep with their young. Who else has held the oceans in his hand? Who has measured off the heavens with his fingers? Who else knows the weight of the earth or has weighed the mountains and hills on a scale? Who is able to advise the Spirit of the Lord? Who knows enough to give him advice or teach him? Has the Lord ever needed anyone's advice? Does he need instruction about what is good? Did someone teach him what is right or show him the path of justice? No, for all the nations of the world are but a drop in a bucket. They are nothing more than dust on the scales. He picks up the whole earth as though it were a grain of sand. All the wood in Lebanon's forests and all Lebanon's animals would not be enough to make a burnt offering worthy of our God. The nations of the world are worth nothing to him. In his eyes they count for less than nothing, mere emptiness and froth. To whom can you compare God? What image can you find to resemble him? Can he be compared to an idol formed in a mold, overlaid with gold and decorated with silver chains? Or if people are too poor for that, they might at least choose wood that won't decay and a skilled craftsman to carve an image that won't fall down. Haven't you heard? Don't you understand? Are you deaf to the words of God, the words he gave before the world began? Are you so ignorant? God sits above the circle of the earth. The people below seem like grasshoppers to him. He spreads out the heavens like a curtain and makes his tent from them. He judges the great people of the world and brings them all to nothing. They hardly get started, barely taking root when he blows on them and they wither. The wind carries them off like chaff. To whom will you compare me? Who is my equal? Asked the Holy One. Look up into the heavens. Who created all the stars? He brings them out like an army, one after another, calling each by its name. Because of his great power and incomparable strength, not a single one is missing. O Jacob, how can you say the Lord does not see your troubles? O Israel, how can you say God ignores your rights? Have you not heard? Have you never understood? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of all the earth. He never grows weak or weary. No one can measure the depths of his understanding. He gives power to the weak and strength to the powerless. Even youths will become weak and tired, and young men will fall in exhaustion. But those who trust in the Lord will find new strength. They will soar high on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not faint. So as we read, we see chapter 40 is the lead-in, the start of the second half of Isaiah. Dr. Oswald discusses three questions in Isaiah's mind that he is trying to answer in chapters 40 through 55. And the first is, what will motivate God's people to actually trust him and become the servants they are called to be? You know, Isaiah has totally covered the trust aspect in the first 39 chapters. You know, who should you trust? Well, you should trust God. There's no doubt that that's the proper answer. Well, how do you motivate God's people, Israel, to actually trust him and become those servants? How is it possible, the second, for sinful Israel to become God's servants? And that's a lot of what is happening in the second half of Israel. The topics are all about servanthood and serving God. And then what is to be done about the sin that alienates them from God? You know, chapter 40 is one of hope. If Israel's exiled to Babylon, as was prophesied, was God not strong enough, not big enough to deal with the Babylonian gods and prevent that? Or was he not big enough, strong enough to deal with Israel's sin that caused them to go into exile? The answer is God wasn't defeated. He allowed the children of Israel as judgment to go into exile in Babylon. And of course, coming out of exile is unheard of. And the fact that he promises that they would come out of exile is something to be excited about. And so he is plenty big enough, and he is plenty capable enough. And chapter 40 has two sections, and verses 1 to 11, as we'll look through, shows he will deliver his people. He'll bring them back. In 12 through 26, you know, Isaiah shows how capable God is and how big God is. And I said two sections. There's really a third one, verses 27 to 31, that kind of summarizes the previous two sections. So we jump into chapter 40, verses 1 to 11. And right off the bat, in the first couple of verses, why speak of comfort to his people? Well, in this case, when you feel the weight of your sin and your position with God, you want assurance that he's going to forgive you. And that's exactly where Israel is at this time. They've sinned. They know they've sinned. They feel the weight of that sin. And you know, the promise of coming back from exile is so much for them that they need to know the comfort that God can provide and give to them. Now, why are their sins pardoned? And we see that he's paid twice. They've paid twice for their sins. And the double implies that it's completely paid. There's nothing left over. And if some of the language, the double means to actually fold in two. And so the two halves are perfectly matched up and lined up, meaning that the payment exactly matches what the debt is. And so Israel's sins are pardoned because God says they're pardoned. And then we get to verses 6 to 11. We get the highway picture from chapter 35. Remember, there was this highway, straight, narrow, and cleared all the way up to the brand new Jerusalem, the new city. And so now we have this highway picture, which is straight and smooth, that's prepared for the king. The picture in 35 is for the people. This highway is for the king, for God to come down to his people and come to them and know that he will be revealed, and there's no excuses not to know who he is. This is such a straight, beautiful highway. Clearly, you can see for miles and miles and miles, there's no way that you cannot see who God is. And so he's made that path clear. And we read about that in Matthew, Mark, and John, where Jesus talks about John the Baptist being that voice, preparing the way. So that brings us to the 3 points in verses 6 to 11. He's told, the voice is told to shout out. And what do I shout, he says? Well, there's 3 points. 1, the grass fades and withers, yet God's word stands. God's word is eternal. So no matter how weak and spindly we are like grass, when we burn up and fade, even when it says when God breathes on us, we fade away. God's word stands forever. And the second point is that, shout out the good news. God is coming. And the third point is, not only is God coming, but he's coming in power. He is coming also with tenderness, the tenderness of the shepherd, carrying the lamb and leading his flock. Major points and beautiful picture of what is happening and what is going to be like when God comes. So the second section, verses 12 through 26, beautiful description of God. And I gave you some verses there. How do you describe God from these verses? Well, in verse 12, we see that he is big and mighty. Who else has held the oceans? He can hold the oceans. He has measured heaven way beyond our imagination and capability. In verse 13 and 14, he's all knowing. Who can advise him? Who can teach God? And the rhetorical question is no one. He is God. In 15, he is, the world is like grains of sand. He is that big and mighty again. He can hold the world just like it's a grain of sand, like we would pick up a handful of sand. In 16 and 17, we see that he is righteous and holy. The description is, if you got all the wood from the forest of Lebanon and all the animals and made one big majestic sacrifice, that wouldn't be enough. That would not satisfy God's righteousness and God's holiness. He is not, we can't come to him in our own power. And so we've got to come to him according to his. And verses 18 there and 20, he's incomparable. It describes the process of making idols. First, you take some stone or wood and then gild it with gold. But if you're poor, you just get a nice piece of wood and you make sure it doesn't fall over. But he's incomparable. You can make idols, but there's nothing. Who are you kidding? There's nothing that compares in something that you can make that compares to who God is and match God. In verse 21, 22, we see that he's transcendent. He's above the whole world. He's outside the world. And yet he sees all of it and he cares deeply about what's going on and he interacts. And 23 and 24, he's the judge of mankind. All the great nations, to us they're great, but to him they're nothing. And he looks down at those that declare themselves great. In 25 and 26, we see that he's the creator of all. He has named the stars. He keeps them in place, and he doesn't lose any of them. He is the creator. So the message to the exiles is, God wasn't defeated. God forgives them and he'll take care of them. And why? Because he's God. And, they have nothing to fear from him in the way of him not living up to the promises he makes. And so we see, how does Isaiah summarize in the last section, verses, I said 26, I meant 27 through 31. Israel, God sees you, and he doesn't ignore you. He is everlasting. He's the creator who doesn't grow weary. He doesn't faint. He has the power and strength, and he can give it to his people to encourage them. He strengthens the weak and encourages the poor. And if you trust in him, you will be able to soar like on wings of eagles and not grow tired and not grow weary as you're moving forward through life. So what is the lesson for us today? 2 points I make: hope and comfort. He starts off with comfort, and this is a whole chapter on hope. Isaiah is bringing Israel hope and comfort for their future problems. He's prophesying about what happens when they come back from exile. No one's ever come back from exile. And so he's prophesying that there is hope and comfort when they do come back, that God will forgive, God will provide, and God will continue to protect. And why? Because he is God and he's capable. And for the lesson for us is the God of the Old Testament, the God of Isaiah, is the same God in the New Testament. He is the same God that we worship. He is the Father of Jesus Christ, the Redeemer, the Messiah. He is God above. He is not like anyone else. And so the lesson for us is, Isaiah trusted, Hezekiah learned to trust. We too in the New Testament can trust God for the exact same reasons that Isaiah is expressing here in this chapter. He is the everlasting. He is the creator of the universe. He is righteous and holy. He's provided a pardon to us for our sin through Jesus Christ. He is transcendent above the earth, but he's not removed. He is an active part of the world, and he is engaged in his creation and in our lives. And so we can look to him. We can trust his word. His word is everlasting. His word is forever. And so we can trust him just as Isaiah could back in these days, prophesying to the kings of Israel and Judah. So I hope to see you next week. See you in the Sunday school class. Otherwise, you'll be able to see this presentation after next Sunday. So have a great weekend.